They didn't just interrupt me, they erased him. 21 times my children cut through my voice like I was a speed bump on the road to their inheritance. I had barely started reading the will, the one Henry wrote with shaky hands, barely holding the pen, when they began peppering me with questions about taxes, equity, and long-term vision. They smiled through it, called me Mom like a code word for compliance, but I'd already hit record. I knew that day would come, not because I distrusted them, but because grief is revealing. And what it revealed was this: they weren't here to mourn, they were here to manage me, to repurpose our life into revenue. But they underestimated something. They forgot who raised them, they forgot who stayed when it was hard, and most of all, they forgot I still had a voice, and this time, I was going to use it. The morning was too quiet, not peaceful, not gentle, just the kind of silence that settles in a house when it forgets what it's waiting for. 7 months had passed since Henry died, and yet the chair beside the window still leaned the way he left it, angled slightly west to catch the last of the afternoon light. I hadn't moved it. Couldn't. That chair had formed to him over the years, like the house had formed to us. I stood by the kitchen counter, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, letting the chipped ceramic press against my palms, grounding me. The maple outside had started turning. Deep gold at the tips. Henry would have said, perfect tea weather, the way he always did, as if autumn brewed itself fresh just for us. 43 years, and the season still arrived on schedule. Only now they came alone. I walked down the hallway, my slippers dragging slightly over the old wood, creaking at just the right spots like it always had. This house knew me. It remembered every step, every sigh, every slammed door from our younger years. There was a dent in the baseboard by the pantry from when Henry accidentally knocked over the high chair. Rachel had been too. I hadn't sanded it down. Not then, not now. That dent was part of the story. I used to think sacrifice was something noble, that giving up pieces of yourself for someone else meant you were doing life right. And maybe for a while, it was. When Henry's mother had her stroke in '79, I withdrew from college mid-semester. No one asked me to. I just did it. I moved into her house, cooked her meals, bathed her when the nurses couldn't come. Henry was grateful. He told me I was strong, that he couldn't have done it without me. Years later, when his job required us to move 3 times in 5 years, I left behind work friends, little jobs I had started to enjoy, and a small art studio I'd begun to rent by the hour. Each time, I told myself, new beginnings, fresh starts, for the family. That was the mantra. Now the walls echoed different voices. Henry's voice, faded like sun-bleached photographs. The kids' voices, more urgent, less warm, pinged from my inbox instead of down the hall. 3 emails had arrived that week. Not one of them asked how I was holding up. Not one of them mentioned Henry's name. Troy's email came first. Subject line, Legacy Property Inquiry. He asked if I had reviewed the current zoning laws, if I had consulted an appraiser, and if I'd be open to discussing a liquidity strategy for the estate. Rachel followed 2 days later. Hers was more polished, more subtle. She called it an opportunity to modernize the family's assets. She attached a mock-up of a retreat center, complete with renderings of the barn converted into an event venue. The phrase upscale rustic charm was underlined. Neither of them said, "How are you?" Neither asked if I'd been sleeping, if I still set a second cup out by habit in the morning. They were coming next week, said they wanted to review Dad's final intentions in person. But I knew what they meant. They meant, let's divide the spoils. They meant, let's get this done. Henry had written his final will by hand 3 weeks before he was admitted to hospice. We had already prepared the formal document with Quinn, our lawyer, but he insisted on one last version. They need to hear it from you, he told me, eyes soft, voice fading like a tide pulling back. Not a stranger, not some lawyer in a suit. You. I hadn't read it aloud yet. I hadn't had the strength. But now, as the light spilled across the counter and the clock ticked too loud in the silence, I felt the paper call to me. I walked to the drawer where I had kept the cream-colored folder, untouched since the morning of the funeral. I opened it slowly, careful not to smudge the edges. His handwriting, once so bold, now trembled across the page like it was fighting gravity. And yet, his words were clear. Loving, unflinching. They had no idea what was written in those pages, no clue what Henry chose to say in those final lines. But they would. And not just because they needed to hear it, because I needed to say it. I glanced out the window. The wind tugged gently at the trees. The barn stood steady in the distance, its frame weathered but proud. I took a long breath, then another. They were coming home, but they wouldn't find the woman they remembered. Not the mother who swallowed every disappointment. Not the widow who cried quietly behind closed doors. This time, I wasn't going to be the one folding. I stepped into Henry's office and closed the door behind me with more intention than I expected. The scent inside hadn't changed. Leather, cedar, a faint trace of pipe tobacco he hadn't touched in years, but which lingered like a memory that refused to leave. His desk stood exactly as he left it, dust gathering around the edges, but the center remained clear, as if waiting for one more task. The folder was tucked in the second drawer on the left, cream-colored, unmarked, unassuming. I lifted it slowly, like it might bruise if I moved too fast. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Not from grief, not anymore, but from the weight of knowing what came next. The handwritten pages inside were thick with meaning. Henry had always been deliberate. Every line felt like a farewell whispered in ink. I read it again, even though I already knew every sentence. But this time, I read slower, aloud to the quiet. I needed to hear his voice in my mouth. The will began with gratitude, how he spoke of me not just as his wife, but as the cornerstone of everything he built. He named the house, the land, the small inheritance accounts, and then, carefully, his wishes. Everything was to be shared equally among the children. But I knew that wasn't the original plan. That first version, we had written it months before his diagnosis, left everything to me. Not out of selfishness, but practicality. I had cared for the land. I had been the keeper of the house, the records, the bills, the one who knew which tree needed extra pruning in spring and which pipe would freeze if the kitchen window was left cracked in January. But I had insisted. I told Henry it wouldn't look right, that if the children felt left out, it would breed resentment. Better to share now, I had said, evenly, cleanly. He'd hesitated, I remember that. His eyes had narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in disappointment. Not in me, in them. They haven't earned it, he'd said softly. Not all of it. But he agreed, because I asked, because I thought doing the right thing meant giving even to those who had already turned away. Now in this final version, there was a folded slip of paper tucked inside the back cover. I had missed it the first time I read the will. It was wedged between the last page and the folder lining as if meant only for me. I unfolded it. The handwriting was weaker here, more fragile, just one sentence. If they forget who you are, then you must remember. No salutation, no signature, just that. I sat down slowly in his old leather chair, the one with the cracked arms and the familiar creak when you lean too far to the left. Those words struck harder than any legal clause ever could, because I had forgotten, not completely, but in small ways over years, I had allowed their dismissals to settle over me like dust, subtle, almost invisible, but heavy in accumulation. Every time Troy ignored my advice, every time Rachel talked over me like I was a well-meaning antique. Every time they called only to ask about next steps, never to ask if I was lonely. I hadn't pushed back. I had folded quietly, like I'd done all my life, but Henry hadn't forgotten. And now, I wouldn't either. I opened the drawer again and pulled out an old voice recorder Henry used to keep on his desk. It still had the same scuff mark from the day Eli knocked it off the shelf trying to reach for jelly beans. I checked the batteries, still good. I pressed the record button and tested it. A red light blinked steady. The meeting with the lawyer was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. Troy and Rachel had both confirmed they'd be there. Rachel even suggested a structured agenda, as if we were discussing a product launch and not their father's last wishes. I held the recorder in my hand for a moment longer, then placed it carefully inside a drawer I would carry to the dining room when the time came. I wasn't afraid of confrontation. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I was awake now, awake in a way I hadn't been in years. There was something sacred about knowing you've done your part, about standing firm in silence when the noise around you grows too loud. And as I sat there, surrounded by the echoes of Henry's steady life, the books he dog-eared, the pens lined neatly in their holder, the tiny cracked globe he never threw away, I understood what he had been trying to do. He wasn't just leaving instructions, he was leaving permission. Permission for me to take up space again, to be the final word, not the afterthought. So I folded the note, placed it in my pocket, and stood. They could come with their folders and forecasts, their design plans and equity splits. They could try to manage me the way they managed everything else. But they were about to learn that I was still Henry's wife, still the keeper of this land, and I was no longer interested in asking for permission to protect what mattered. Rachel arrived precisely at 10:02 a.m., the kind of arrival that said, "I don't need to knock," as she stepped out of her sleek silver SUV in boots that cost more than our old pickup used to be worth. Her coat was cinched at the waist, a camel color too pristine for farm dust, and her hair was pulled back tight, as if even her strands obeyed her schedule. She didn't glance around the porch, didn't notice the ivy that Henry and I had planted 30 years ago, now curling over the window frames like they were trying to protect the house. She simply walked in, calling out, "Mother," like she was checking into a bed and breakfast. I heard her heels tap against the hardwood as she set her bag on the hall bench. A moment later, the fridge door opened, then closed, then opened again. "You don't have any almond milk?" she called. I stood by the sink and counted to 3 before answering. "No, Rachel, just regular milk from cows." She appeared in the doorway with her tablet already open, stylus poised. "We'll need to do a grocery run later. I'll make a list." She didn't ask how I was. 3 hours later, Troy arrived. No hug, no greeting. Just a gust of wind as he walked in and dropped his overnight bag by the stairs. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne layered over something metallic. Airport air, maybe. He kicked off his shoes, scanned the kitchen and said, "What's the Wi-Fi password?" I gave it to him without looking up. By noon, they had both made themselves comfortable in the dining room. Rachel spread out blueprints and digital renderings across the table like a catalog spread. Troy stood at the head of the table with his laptop connected to the TV, a PowerPoint titled Weston Renewal, Legacy Reimagined glowing on the screen. I sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, a mug of cold tea untouched beside me. Troy began the presentation with a confident smile, the kind he probably used on investors. "We're thinking multi-purpose event space, something upscale but approachable, wedding weekends, wellness retreats, even business offsites. The land practically markets itself. We just need to package it." He clicked to the next slide. Pie charts, revenue projections, foot traffic analysis. Rachel chimed in, gesturing to a 3D rendering of the barn transformed into an airy, glass-fronted venue space. "We've already been in touch with a few local consultants. There's serious potential here, Mom." Mom, that word again, used like a password to gain access, not like an acknowledgement of me as a person. They spoke for 20 minutes straight. Neither asked what I thought. Neither asked if I was ready to talk about the will. And then came the twist. Rachel scrolled through her files and opened an email chain marked Preliminary Site Assessment. She passed her tablet to Troy, who grinned. "Oh, this is great. The architect came by Tuesday afternoon, said the barn structure's still sound. With a bit of reinforcement, we're looking at low renovation costs." I blinked. "Architect?" Rachel looked up, unbothered. "Yes, from Bauer and Lynn. I had him do a quick walkthrough while you were napping. It was the only time he could fit in." The words hit like cold water. My home, my land, toured, measured, discussed behind closed doors while I slept. I looked at the tablet. The report included square footage, material estimates, and a section labeled Recommended Modernization. They had plans, real ones, not just ideas, not just hopes. They had come to claim, not to ask. Rachel picked up again. "We understand this is sensitive, Mom, but we're trying to be forward-thinking. The estate needs to evolve. Sentiment can't outweigh practicality." Troy nodded. "You've done more than enough for this place. Let us carry it forward. With the right vision, this land can finally realize its full potential." Their language wasn't just clinical, it was condescending. And in their eyes, I wasn't a stakeholder. I was a gatekeeper, temporary, replaceable. I looked at the screen one last time. Our barn, our land, reduced to design mock-ups and projected ROI. Then I stood without a word and left the room. Behind me, their voices lowered but didn't stop. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel something shift inside me. Not just anger, something deeper, recognition. They didn't see me as part of this legacy. To them, I was an obstacle to manage, a sentimental figurehead to reassure until they got the keys. But Henry had seen this coming, and so had I, deep down. Which is why the recorder in the drawer downstairs wasn't a safety net. It was ammunition. The next morning, the air felt heavy, like it knew something important was about to be torn apart. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing a navy blouse Henry had always said made me look capable but kind. The dining room was already set up like a boardroom. Troy had moved the table, positioning chairs in a half circle like a corporate pitch meeting. Rachel had lit one of her candles, cinnamon sickly sweet, and arranged water glasses like we were hosting a press conference. They were both already seated when I entered, tablet and notepad at the ready. I didn't sit right away. I placed the cream-colored folder in front of me, closed. I let my fingers rest on top of it, feeling the weight of Henry's final handwriting beneath the paper. "I'll begin reading now," I said, my voice calm but firm. Troy nodded, as if granting permission. I opened the folder and unfolded the pages, the soft creases catching the light. I started reading, carefully articulating each word, honoring every phrase Henry had written by hand. I, Henry Allen Weston, being of sound mind? Wait, Rachel cut in, already tapping her tablet. Which date is on that version? I just want to be sure we're looking at the most recent iteration. I paused. March 18th, 3 weeks before hospice. She nodded slowly. Okay, I just know there were a few drafts floating around. You know how confusing these things can get. I resumed. I leave to my wife, Margaret Weston, the house located at... Troy raised a finger. Hold on, is that notarized? Because I didn't see a stamp when I skimmed the photocopy. It's his handwriting, I said. His signature is at the end. He leaned back. But if it's not legally notarized, wouldn't the typed version take precedence? I mean, legally speaking. I inhaled slowly and kept reading. By paragraph 3, the interruptions had multiplied. Rachel asked about tax implications. Troy wanted to know if the land was appraised at current market value. Rachel questioned whether the irrevocable trust clause could be revisited given the evolving real estate climate. I kept going. They interrupted again, asking if Henry had really written this alone, or if Lena, our estate lawyer, had guided the phrasing. Henry wrote this one entirely by hand, I said. I found it after he passed. It was tucked in his desk. Rachel tilted her head. Still, it would help to have that confirmed independently, just for transparency. I folded the page gently and began the next. More interruptions, 21 in total. I counted, not aloud, not visibly, but inside. I etched each one like a notch into my spine. By the time I reached the final paragraph, my voice was steady, but my heart thudded with something bitter. And then Rachel said, "Would it be all right if I scan that copy later, just so we can each have a digital version?" I paused. She smiled, pleasant, professional. "Just for clarity, we can all compare notes that way." I nodded slowly. "You can make a copy, but the original stays with me." "Of course," she said too quickly. After lunch, while Troy stepped outside to take a call, Rachel followed me to the study where the printer was. I handed her a printed copy I had made that morning. She looked disappointed, her hand lingering. "I thought we'd copy directly from the original," she asked, voice smooth. "It's fragile," I said, "and it's staying with me." She accepted the copy with a tight smile, but what I didn't see, until later that night, was that while I was reaching for a second sheet of paper, she had slipped something into her purse. It wasn't until I was cleaning the study that evening that I noticed the page order was off in the stack. One sheet was missing, a middle page that detailed Henry's specific wishes about preserving the land and protecting Eli's share. I froze, checked the folder. The original was still intact, untouched, thank God. I stood there for a long time, one hand gripping the desk. Rachel had tried to remove a piece of the story, a quiet theft disguised as paperwork. The next morning, I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I simply folded the original will and slipped it back into the folder, locking it inside the drawer of Henry's desk. At breakfast, they were already planning. We should schedule a surveyor, Troy was saying, even if it's preliminary, just to get a sense of the lines. Rachel added, I'll reach out to the zoning board. Better to start early before permits get backlogged. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down. I didn't speak. They didn't notice. Later that afternoon, I gathered my things, took the original will, the recorder, and the voice file I had saved from the previous day's reading. I placed it all inside a fireproof lockbox Henry had kept under the bed. At dinner, Troy asked if we could revisit the equity breakdown after dessert. I looked at him, then I looked at Rachel, and I said simply, we'll wait for the lawyer. Rachel blinked. Oh, I thought this was more of a preliminary phase. We'll wait, I repeated. Troy pushed back his chair and stood. Well, don't wait too long. Things move fast, and we need to be prepared. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it, and let the water run a little longer than necessary. Behind me, the silence stretched like wire, and that night, when the house had gone still again, I sat in Henry's chair and stared at the place where his handwriting curled across the page. They hadn't just dismissed me, they had tried to rewrite him, but I still had the story, and this time, I would tell it my way. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand trailing the smooth railing Henry had varnished himself 15 years ago. It creaked under my weight, the same way it always had, like it recognized me. When I reached the top, I paused at the landing, listening. Laughter drifted up faintly from the kitchen. Rachel's voice sharp and amused, Troy's low and calculating. They weren't laughing at a memory. They were laughing at a plan. In my bedroom, the curtains were half drawn, and the late afternoon sun slanted across the quilt Henry and I had picked out in Asheville on our 35th anniversary. The bed was made, the air still. I sat at my writing desk and opened my journal, a leather-bound book Henry had given me one Christmas when the kids were still in high school. The pen felt heavy in my hand. People don't die when they stop breathing, Henry once told me. They die when no one remembers who they really were. I had laughed at the time, calling it morbid. He hadn't smiled. He meant it. And now I finally understood. I began writing, the pen gliding smoothly across the paper, almost automatically. The words weren't elegant, but they were honest. I wrote about what it felt like to stand in a room where my children pitched business plans over my husband's legacy, like it was a forgotten tract of land up for auction. I wrote about the ache of being invisible, of being present but unacknowledged. Downstairs, chairs scraped against hardwood. The fridge opened, Rachel's voice again, this time more serious. I stopped writing and listened. She's holding it together for now, Rachel said. But once we finalize the transfer, we'll help her transition. There's a really nice care facility outside Stamford, high-end, boutique style. We can pitch it as a wellness retreat. Troy chuckled. You think she'll go for it? She won't have a choice, Rachel replied. Once the property is in the LLC, she'll just be a resident. I sat still, completely still, not shocked, not even hurt, just hollow. They weren't planning a future. They were planning my removal. I closed the journal and stood up. My legs didn't shake. My spine didn't bend. If they wanted to erase me, they'd have to reckon with the parts of me that were too deeply rooted to uproot. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled down a worn cardboard box labeled MISC. It hadn't been opened in years. Dust coated the lid. Inside were old receipts, school programs, a few of Henry's retirement files. I dug deeper until I found a thick manila envelope, heavier than the rest. It was filled with documents, typed, hand-annotated, and clipped together by decade. At the top was a handwritten title, Scholarship Proposal, EWH Fund. I blinked, EWH, Elliot William Henry, our grandson. But this proposal was older than Eli, dated back to 2006. I read the summary. Henry had drafted a long-term plan to fund scholarships for low-income students from the local high school. He'd made notes on fundraising partners, outlined a budget, and even listed potential mentors in the area. On one page, he'd written, "Let them believe in more than luck." Tears welled in my eyes. I hadn't known, not even a whisper. It was something he had worked on quietly, like planting seeds for trees he'd never see bloom. None of the kids knew. They never asked. never saw past the surface of their father's quiet kindness, and here they were, plotting to tear down the very soil he'd prepared for something better. I placed the folder on my bed and opened a new section in my journal titled Things They Never Asked. Under it, I wrote, "Why did Dad spend so many weekends at the school office? Why was Mom always up late in January doing the taxes by hand? What did the barn smell like in October? What did we lose when we stopped listening?" Downstairs, another voice chimed in, Rachel again. "We should schedule a contractor next week. Just get the initial estimates rolling. If we wait for Mom's blessing, we'll be here until Thanksgiving." Troy's response was muffled, but I heard enough. They were already drawing blueprints around my absence. I took the scholarship file, my journal, and Henry's last will and placed them all inside the old lockbox. I added the voice recorder. Then I slid the box beneath the bed, tapping the edge twice, the way Henry always had when closing something for good. Then I sat back down and opened the curtains fully. The sun had dipped lower, casting long gold streaks across the floorboards. The trees outside swayed gently, unaware of the battle unfolding within their shadow. For a long time, I simply watched. I wasn't waiting for them to come upstairs. I knew they wouldn't. They had already forgotten I was here. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. No laughter, no clinking glasses, no shuffle of business shoes across the floor. I took my tea to the study and opened my email, a ritual more out of habit than hope. But there it was, at the top of my inbox, Property Lease Intent Submission, Weston Holdings. My heart stilled. I opened the email. The attached PDF was a signed pre-agreement document. Troy had sent it the day before our family meeting, before I even opened Henry's will aloud. The lease proposal outlined terms for a third-party development firm to begin preliminary site evaluation, with an option to fully lease the eastern and southern lots of the property within 6 months. Under the signature line, Troy had written, "Acting on behalf of future co-owners." Future, not present, not legal, not true. I closed the document and stared at the wall for a long moment, breathing evenly, slowly. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Quinn. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, clipped like always. "Margaret?" "I need to initiate protection measures," I said without any preamble. "I believe there's been an attempt to circumvent the estate process." There was a pause on her end, then the sound of typing. "You're referring to activity outside of the will's stated terms?" "Yes, and I have proof." I told her everything about the attempted removal of a page, the architect who toured without my knowledge, and now the lease document sent without consent. "I have the original handwritten will," I continued. "I also have the first version Henry and I drafted, the one where everything was left to me before I talked him into the revised version." Another pause, longer this time. "You still have the first version?" she asked carefully. "Yes, Henry told me to keep it. Said if things ever went sideways, I'd know what to do." Quinn's tone shifted, quiet but urgent. "Email me scans of everything and send me the audio recording of your family reading, all of it." "I will." "And Margaret," she added, "you're doing the right thing." After I hung up, I moved with purpose. The original handwritten will, the old typed version, the recorder, the voice file. I scanned each item and attached them one by one to the email, labeling them with dates and annotations. Before I hit send, I paused. A memory drifted in. Henry sitting at this very desk 3 years ago, looking over the first draft of the will with his glasses slipping down his nose. "If they forget who you are," he'd said, "then you remember who you are. And if they forget who I was, you tell them." And then he'd slid the original draft into a manila folder and looked at me. "This one is for you," he whispered, "in case you ever need to remember that I trusted you more than anyone else." That version had never left my possession. In it, there were no shared percentages, no equity discussions, just one line. "To my wife, Margaret Weston, I leave the entirety of my estate, for I know she will do right by what we built." It had been my idea to change it, to share, to be fair. And now look where that had gotten us. I pressed send. The files shot into the ether toward Quinn's waiting inbox. Then I turned off the lamp and sat in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe, the kind that hums at the edge of something inevitable. Downstairs, I heard a door open, then close, distant voices. Maybe they were discussing brunch. Maybe they were strategizing about who to call next, but none of it mattered now. The paper was moving, the law was awakening, and I was no longer asking to be included. I was positioning myself to be heard. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking the perimeter of the land. The leaves rustled gently overhead, whispering in a language older than any of us. The orchard felt the same under my boots, solid, unchanged. Henry had loved this land like it was his brother, had tended every tree like it was a story worth telling. By the time the sun began to set, I returned to the house without speaking to either of them. I moved like a shadow through familiar rooms, gathering what mattered. I wasn't running. I was preparing. And when I passed the dining room, I saw Rachel and Troy hunched over their tablets again, drawing lines across land they no longer truly understood. They didn't look up, didn't notice, didn't know that while they whispered about controlling the future, I had already passed the matchstick to someone who would burn their blueprints in broad daylight. The silence wrapped around me again as I climbed the stairs, but this time it wasn't emptiness. It was resolve. It was the calm before the return. The next morning I woke before dawn, the house still cloaked in blue shadows. Rachel and Troy were asleep, at least I assumed they were. Their rooms were quiet, no flicker of hallway light, no clatter of early coffee. I made my way downstairs with bare feet, each floorboard groaning beneath me like an old friend reminding me I wasn't alone. I brewed a small pot of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, the steam curling upward like a prayer. My fingers tapped slowly across the worn wood of the table as I stared into the orchard. I didn't see trees. I saw purpose, the same purpose Henry had written down in a folder nobody else had bothered to open. Later that morning, I called the number listed in one of Henry's old files, the Green Roots Collective, a local nonprofit that focused on sustainable farming and youth mentorship. I'd heard the name in passing, but Henry had kept correspondence with one of their board members. Her name was Clarice. I found a faded business card tucked between notes in his original orchard sketches. She answered on the third ring. I introduced myself slowly, not sure how to begin, but when I said Henry's name, her tone shifted. Henry Weston? He was working on a community proposal with us years ago, before he got sick. I thought the project had fallen through. I told her it hadn't fallen. It had just been hidden, waiting, like seeds underground. Clarice was quiet for a long moment, then said, "If you still have the plans, we'd love to see them." I scanned Henry's hand-drawn maps, notes about irrigation, a loose budget drafted in his crisp block letters. I emailed the entire file that afternoon with a note. He wanted this to last longer than we did. Within 2 hours, Clarice responded. They were impressed, deeply. She wrote that their board had been searching for heritage property to develop into a permanent agricultural and community education center. They would provide funding, staffing, infrastructure, if the land could be designated as a community conservation trust. It would protect the orchard from commercial redevelopment, keep it public, open, useful. In short, it would stay his. My hands trembled as I read the proposal. I didn't need time to decide. I wrote one word, yes. Then I attached the old deed map and began the process of preparing the land transfer. By the time Rachel and Troy came down for breakfast, I was already 2 steps ahead of them. Rachel sat at the counter, sipping her protein shake and tapping away on her laptop. Troy scrolled on his phone, barely looking up, the usual. But then Rachel stood, stretched, and said, "Back in a minute," leaving her computer open on the kitchen island. A mistake, one she hadn't made all week. I hadn't meant to pry, I truly hadn't. But my eyes landed on a highlighted email subject line. Phase 2, Estate Transition Plan. I clicked it. Inside was a detailed document she had drafted with a consultant named Amanda Klein. It was clean, efficient, cold. The outline detailed how, once the asset transfer was complete, I would be relocated to a residential care facility with dignity and minimal resistance. There were even talking points. Emphasize rest and relaxation. Remind her this is what Henry would have wanted. Frame it as less stress and more freedom. One note stood out in bold. If she becomes emotional, redirect, do not engage in debate. The final line? Once Margaret is settled, we can proceed with commercial zoning and rebranding. I stared at the screen for a long time, my mouth dry, the sound of my own pulse louder than anything in the room. This wasn't just ambition. It was betrayal. They hadn't just forgotten me. They were planning to erase me. I closed the laptop gently. The click of the latch echoed like a closing door. Rachel returned minutes later, oblivious. That afternoon, while they went into town for coffee and errands, I took the nonprofit's proposal file, the land deed copy, and the scholarship folder and packed them carefully into a canvas satchel. I tucked it into the drawer of Henry's desk, the one only I used, then I locked it. Outside, the wind shifted slightly. Leaves rustled like whispers. This was no longer about legacy, it was about reclamation. My steps were slow but sure as I walked back into the heart of the orchard, the center of everything Henry and I had nurtured. Each tree bent gently toward the breeze like it was listening. I rested my hand against the oldest one and whispered, "We're not done." I didn't wait until morning. The minute Rachel and Troy left again, some last-minute meeting with a zoning advisor, I printed every email I had found on Rachel's laptop. The entire Phase 2 plan, every thread between her and the consultants, the notes about my removal, the budget spreadsheet that listed me as transitional oversight to be phased out. Each printed page trembled slightly in my hands as the printer spit them out one by one like verdicts. I didn't stop to think. I stacked them neatly, labeled each one with a sticky note, and placed them into a red file folder I hadn't used since Henry passed. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Clara. Clara wasn't just Eli's legal guardian. She was Henry's cousin on his mother's side. Tough, direct, and the only person in the family who still said exactly what she meant. After Emily died, Clara stepped in without hesitation to raise Eli. No complaints, no dramatics, just consistency and steel. She answered on the first ring. "Clara, it's Margaret," I said. "Is Eli okay?" "Yes, this isn't about him directly," I replied. But it soon could be. I told her everything, the pressure, the interruptions, the draft plans, and now the emails. I explained that Henry's will specifically included a share for Eli, protected under a trust until he came of age. But if the property was developed, if the land was rezoned or commercialized before that trust matured, it would affect Eli's portion, his future, and everything Henry had wanted to preserve. Clara didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "Send me everything." And I did, scanned the emails, the business plan drafts, the zoning application that Troy had sneakily attached his name to, the voice recording from the family meeting, and the copy of the proposal from the nonprofit. I included the clause in the will that specified all heirs must consent before any changes to the land occurred. Within 2 hours, Clara called me back. "I've spoken to Marcus, the trustee. We're filing an injunction first thing in the morning. Any attempt to transfer or develop property without written consent from all beneficiaries, especially Eli's legal guardian, will be considered a breach of fiduciary duty." I exhaled, the first real breath I'd taken in days. "Thank you, Clara." "No," she said. "Thank you for protecting what matters." I hung up and turned toward Henry's office. Something inside me shifted. No more waiting. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the file cabinet and laid out everything I had. The scholarship proposal, the deed history, Henry's orchard diagrams, every version of the will, every note he had scrawled in the margins. I organized them into folders, labeled them by purpose: land, legacy, education, trust. Then I sat at the typewriter Henry had refused to throw away. Its keys stuck slightly, but it still worked. I began drafting the letter that would accompany the property transfer to the Green Roots Collective. I wrote about stewardship, about the difference between owning land and caring for it, about how Henry had planted every tree with intention, not for profit, but for purpose. I described the vision he'd had for the orchard, a place of healing, learning, community. By midnight, my fingers were stained with ink, but the documents were ready. I placed everything into a large manila envelope, sealed it, and labeled it in all caps. Weston Community Trust, final transfer files. The house was silent. Rachel and Troy hadn't returned. Or maybe they had, and simply decided not to speak to me anymore. I didn't mind. In the silence, I heard Henry again, not in words, but in the gentle scrape of tree branches against the siding, in the echo of that typewriter bell when I reached the margin. When morning light finally broke through the curtains, I stepped outside barefoot and walked slowly across the dewy grass. The earth felt soft beneath me, alive, forgiving. I stood at the edge of the orchard, envelope tucked under one arm, coffee in the other. The sun had just risen over the eastern hills, casting long beams of gold between the branches. I lifted my hand toward the light, letting it rest on my skin. It warmed the deep creases of my palm, touched the veins like a blessing. And I thought, this land has never belonged to the loudest. It belongs to the ones who tend it, even when no one watches. It belongs to the ones who return again and again, not for profit, but for purpose. It was time to take back what had always belonged to kindness, to truth, to Henry, to the quiet kind of love that doesn't fade, even when everything else does. The dining room had never looked so unfamiliar. Rachel had spent the afternoon turning it into what she clearly imagined was a high-level strategic summit. Tapered candles lined the center of the table. Each place setting had a name card folded neatly in front of it, printed in a sleek serif font. Margaret Weston, Rachel Weston, Troy Weston. Not mom, not mother, not even Maggie, just Margaret, as if I were a client. Plates were set on pressed linen, and the air smelled faintly of fig and cinnamon from the boutique catering Rachel had insisted on. She'd ordered from a local farm-to-table vendor, probably thinking it would lend their proposal a sense of rural credibility. Troy stood near the fireplace, nursing a glass of Merlot like a man moments away from pitching his startup. Rachel welcomed me like a hotel hostess. "Glad you're here, Mother. We were just getting started." I took my seat. I didn't comment on the candles or the cards or the fact that the room, the house, no longer felt like mine. I simply waited. Rachel gave the opening remarks. "This dinner is about unity," she began, her tone polished. "We know there have been misunderstandings, but we believe tonight is the right moment to align." She gestured for Troy, who clicked a remote. The dining room light dimmed slightly, and the TV screen in the corner came to life. A new presentation, a new name. Weston Legacy Project. The screen displayed slides of artist renderings, upscale event spaces, yoga retreats nestled in the orchard, artisan cottages replacing the tool shed. Rachel narrated with the cadence of a seasoned consultant. "This isn't about profit," she insisted. "It's about sustainability, about honoring what Dad started by making it viable for the next generation." She passed me a printed booklet with mock-ups and timelines. "We see you as a founding partner," she added, smiling like I should be grateful. I took the folder, turned a page, then another. Then I set it down, carefully aligning it with the edge of the placemat. "Thank you," I said, "for all the effort." Rachel looked pleased. "We just want what's best for everyone." I took a sip of water, let the pause stretch long enough to grow sharp. Then I said, "It's already been done." Troy's brow furrowed. "What's already been done?" "The land," I said, looking directly at them. "It's no longer part of this project or any project." Rachel blinked. "I don't understand." "I transferred ownership," I said, to a non-profit, the Green Roots Collective. "The land is now protected under a community conservation trust." Silence. Troy's mouth parted, then closed. He set down his wineglass a little too hard. Rachel's voice was tight. What? "I submitted the documents 2 days ago, with the original deed copy, Henry's legacy notes, and the scholarship fund proposal. The orchard, the barn, the adjacent field, they're no longer available for commercial use." "You had no right," Troy snapped. "I had every right," I said calmly. "Henry left me stewardship. I honored his intentions and I protected what he built." Rachel stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "You went behind our backs." "No," I interrupted. "You went behind mine. I simply stepped around you." Troy rose, red-faced, the CEO confidence slipping. "You can't just give it away." "I didn't give it away," I said. "I ensured its future, something neither of you bothered to ask me about." He turned to Rachel. "Is this even legal?" Rachel was silent, stunned. I continued. "The trustee has been informed. Eli's guardian filed an injunction. The nonprofit's lawyers finalized the transfer. You can call your attorneys in the morning, but it's done. You no longer have a stake in the property. You still have your shares in the trust, but the land? It's no longer yours to touch. For the first time in weeks, they were speechless. Rachel sat down slowly. So what now? We're just excluded? No, I said. You're included, just not in the way you planned. You're welcome to volunteer at the orchard. The nonprofit is accepting mentors for the youth program. They could use guidance from adults who know how to listen. Troy scoffed and walked out of the room without another word. Rachel stared at the candle for a long time, the flame flickering in her reflection. This isn't over, she murmured. It is for me, I replied. She stood, gathered her planner, her tablet, her pride. Then she left, and I sat at the head of the table, surrounded by curated plates, unlit candles, and a presentation folder no one would ever open again. I didn't feel victorious. I felt restored. The next morning, the dining room was silent, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The remnants of last night's transition dinner remained untouched. Empty wine glasses, plates with food gone cold, and Rachel's presentation booklet lying face down like a defeated proposal no one asked for. Quinn arrived just after 9. The sunlight caught in her glasses as she stepped through the front door, her briefcase clasped tight. She greeted me with a quiet nod and placed a thick folder on the dining table. I reviewed everything, she said. It's all clean. The land transfer holds. The nonprofit partnership is secure. What happens next is up to you. I nodded, but my hands trembled slightly as I opened the folder. Inside were the final registration documents for the Green Roots Collective, the tax exemption approval for community land use, and a notarized copy of Henry's handwritten will. Would you mind, I said, voice steadying, if I read it aloud? Just the last paragraph. Quinn blinked, then gave a soft smile. Of course. I stood beside the window where the light fell directly on the page. My voice was clear this time. No tremor, no hesitation. If a man leaves behind a home, I read, he's remembered for a while. If he leaves behind money, they'll remember him only until it's spent. But if he plants something for the people, if he teaches someone how to tend what grows, he becomes part of the roots. The one who plants a tree for the community is more trustworthy than the one who waits for the harvest. I paused. The words hung in the air like scripture. Quinn placed her hand gently on mine. He trusted you, she said, not just to protect what he left, but to decide how it should live on. At that moment, I knew I hadn't just made peace with the past, I had realigned it, quietly, decisively. Quinn continued, There's something else. Since the land is now part of a designated conservation trust, and because it's being used for nonprofit community enrichment, the state has approved an exemption on inheritance tax. I blinked. All of it? She nodded. Every acre, every structure. It's protected, legally and financially. A laugh escaped me, quiet, disbelieving, not out of glee, but relief. The irony was sharp. All those business plans, all those charts and LLC agreements, and I had already solved the one thing they were trying to manipulate, without ever touching a spreadsheet. Quinn gathered her documents and prepared to leave. Before she stepped out, she turned and said, Margaret, for what it's worth, you didn't just outmaneuver them, you outloved them. When she left, I sat alone in the now cleansed dining room. I looked at Henry's will again, tracing the lines of his signature with one finger. The ink had faded in some parts, but the strength of his intent remained, rooted like the orchard he planted. Later that evening, I found a letter on the hallway table, a cream envelope, no name on the front, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Rachel's. I brought it to the kitchen and opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page. Mother, it began. I know I crossed lines. I thought I was preserving something, but I see now it was more about control. I forgot what this place meant to you. To Dad, if you ever decide to revisit the estate structure, I would like a conversation, not a pitch. I understand if that time never comes. There was no signature, just space, and for a brief moment, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something left to salvage. But then I thought of the contractors walking the property while I slept, of the folders labeled post-transition phase, with my name in parentheses, of how silence was used like a weapon, not a choice. I folded the letter once, then again. Then I walked to the fireplace, lit a match, and dropped the folded paper into the flames. The envelope burned fast, quiet and clean, until only ash remained. I didn't smile, I didn't cry, I just watched it disappear. Outside, the orchard swayed in the evening breeze. The sky had turned soft with twilight, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and sun-warmed bark. I stepped onto the porch, the boards cool beneath my feet, and breathed in deep. There were no victory banners, no applause, just the steady, grounded sense that something had finally been put right. And that was enough. The orchard breathed again. It wasn't loud or triumphant. There was no fanfare, no breaking news, just quiet restoration, the kind that comes with muddy hands and sun-warmed backs. A dozen teenagers from the local high school had arrived that morning, backpacks slung low, sleeves rolled up, sneakers already stained with dirt from the walk up the drive. Clarice had arranged the partnership with the school's counselor Devin, a kind-eyed man who had once struggled in the same school halls he now mentored through. The students weren't polished or overly enthusiastic. Some dragged their feet, others stared at their phones when they thought no one was watching. But when we handed them shovels and gloves, something changed. They stepped into the soil and began. We started with the old vegetable patch. The ground was hard, overgrown, but underneath it still remembered what it had once been. I showed the kids how to loosen the soil without damaging the root lines. Devin guided them gently, his voice low and steady. One girl, Lana, asked me how old the orchard was. "Older than you," I said, smiling. "You could say it's been aging with grace." That made her laugh. I told them about Henry, not as a legacy, not as a lesson, but as a person. The way he always wore two mismatched socks. How he hummed without realizing it when pruning trees. How he once spent 3 weeks learning how to graft a pear onto an apple root just because he read it was possible. The kids listened, not because they had to, but because something in the way I spoke made them lean in. After a break for sandwiches and lemonade, a boy named Julian wandered toward the old barn. The others stayed behind, pulling weeds or painting fresh labels on the compost bins. Julian returned 10 minutes later, a dusty object in his hands. "I found this," he said. It was a leather-bound journal. The corners curled, the spine stiff. I took it from him carefully, recognizing Henry's handwriting immediately. I hadn't known about this one. I opened the first page. Inside was a sketch of the orchard, not as it looked now, but as Henry had imagined it might someday become. Arrows pointed to shaded walkways labeled benches, spaces for veterans' gardens, and a greenhouse made from recycled wood. Beneath each section, he had written messages, for the ones who never quite fit in a classroom. For those who want to grow, even when the world calls them weeds. For my grandchildren, even the ones who haven't arrived yet. I turned the pages slowly, my hands trembling slightly. He had made notes on compost cycles, crop rotations, seasonal calendars, all written in his neat, looping script. But more than that, he had written thoughts. Prayers, almost. Quiet hopes for a place he wouldn't live to see. Julian leaned closer. "Did he make all this?" "Yes," I said, my voice catching. "He did." The other kids gathered around as I flipped through the pages. Clarice came over and rested a hand on my shoulder. "You think he meant for this to be found?" I nodded. "Not by me, by them. We decided then and there to frame the pages, not all of them, but a few, and display them in the barn." That afternoon, a local artist arrived. Her name was Raina, and she had volunteered to paint a mural on the barn's south-facing wall. She asked what Henry was like, and the students took turns answering before I could. "He liked trees more than people," Julian said, grinning. "He wanted us to build stuff that mattered," Lana added. "He made weird fruit," another kid chimed in. Raina smiled and got to work. By late afternoon, the sketch had come to life. It was a silhouette of a man kneeling at the base of a young tree, one hand cupped around the roots, the other steadying the trunk. The background was a gentle wash of hills and orchard rows. Underneath, in small, careful letters, it read, "Planted with purpose." I stood there for a long time, just watching. No one asked if I was okay. They didn't need to. One of the younger boys, Andre, walked over and handed me a shovel. "You want to help plant the last one?" I nodded and joined him near the eastern plot, where a young apple tree waited in its burlap sack. We planted it together, his hands fast and eager, mine deliberate and slow. When we finished, he pressed the soil down gently and stood back. "That one's for your husband, right?" he asked. "No," I said, looking at the fresh leaves catching the wind. "That one's from him." The house was quiet that evening, not with tension or grief, but with the kind of stillness that follows restoration. Margaret moved slowly through each room, her fingers brushing along the edges of shelves, the corners of picture frames, the backs of doors. She wasn't packing, she wasn't leaving. She was readying the house not for departure but for presence, true, open, uncluttered presence. In the kitchen, she opened the utensil drawer and took out a chipped wooden spoon Henry had refused to part with. She placed it carefully in the ceramic jar by the stove, not because she would use it, but because it belonged. She moved next to the living room, straightened the throw on the armrest, and placed Henry's old cardigan neatly over the back of his favorite chair. Then she opened the desk drawer and removed the file labeled Immediate. Inside were keys, a notepad, and the final copies of the orchard proposal now housed under nonprofit protections. She didn't need to touch them, just needed to know they were still there. Upstairs, she entered the bedroom and smoothed the quilt across the bed, folded Henry's last worn shirt, and placed it in the cedar chest. Every drawer she closed was a door gently shut, not to forget, but to make room. Room for new conversations, new hands working the soil, new laughter in the barn. When she returned downstairs, the light was low and golden. She walked to the porch, coffee in hand, her feet bare against the wood. From there, she could see the orchard bathed in dusk, the mural glowing faintly, the new saplings casting long shadows, the silhouettes of students biking home along the dirt road. Then she saw her. Far beyond the garden rows, just past the edge of the last fence line, stood Rachel. She wasn't moving, wasn't waving, just standing in the tall grass, arms crossed, watching. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't raise her hand or call out. She simply stood still and let the moment exist. There was no anger left, no righteousness, only clarity. Rachel had made her choices. Margaret had made hers. After a long minute, Rachel turned and walked away, the field swallowing her shape into the dimming horizon. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped back inside. That night, she opened Henry's old cigar box, the one he had kept in the study drawer, filled with ticket stubs, loose coins, and notes written on napkins. She took out a clean sheet of stationery, the one she had saved for special letters, and began to write. Dear Henry, I don't know how to start this in any other way than to say, I kept my promise. You asked me to protect what we built, and I did. They came just as you feared. They wanted to slice it up, name it, rebrand it, sell it. They smiled through their betrayal. They called it the future, but I knew better. You left me enough, not just in documents and trust terms, but in sketches, in notes, in memories of how your hands touched every tree as if it was sacred. I remembered the way you used to speak about legacy, not as something to inherit, but something to tend. So I tended it. I found the group you once reached out to, Green Roots. They remembered you. More importantly, they believed in what you started. The land is safe now, Henry. It won't be sold. It won't be paved. It will be planted, taught, shared. Your journal was found by a boy who doesn't speak much, but who watched me like I mattered. He and the others have begun clearing the garden, repainting the signs. One girl asked if the orchard always smelled like lavender. I told her only when someone was paying attention. Rachel came back briefly. She didn't say a word, just stood in the field like a shadow of herself. I didn't call to her, didn't invite her in. Some things need silence more than they need reconciliation. And me? I'm tired, but not the kind of tired that breaks. It's a good tired, the kind that follows effort you believe in, the kind that ends in sleep, not worry. I'm writing this from your desk. Your chair still creaks the same way it did when you leaned back to read seed catalogs out loud to me. Everything feels different now, Henry, but not wrong, just earned. So I'm closing this letter with something you once said and probably forgot, but I never did. Plant something that will outlast you, and you never truly disappear. You haven't disappeared. You're in the soil. You're in the mural on the barn wall. You're in the hands of those kids pulling weeds and learning names of trees. You're in me. And now? I think I'm finally ready to stop holding my breath. Let's let it grow. Love always, Margaret. She folded the letter and placed it inside the cigar box. Then she turned off the lights, walked to the window, and watched the moonlight slip gently across the orchard rows, silent, steady, sacred.